I was a night shift security guard at a luxury hotel for 4 years, and what I witnessed in those corridors, between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., changed the way I see people forever. I want to start by saying that I am not a dramatic person. I never have been. I grew up in a pretty average household in a mid-sized city in the Midwest, went to a state college, studied criminal justice because I thought maybe I'd end up in law enforcement someday, and then kind of drifted into private security work when the job market didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for me after graduation. I wasn't bitter about it. It paid okay, the hours were predictable, and honestly I liked the quiet of it. Most security work is just presence. You show up, you walk the floors, you make sure nothing goes wrong, and then you go home. Simple, unglamorous, fine. That was my mindset when I took the job at the Alderton Grand. If you've never heard of it, the Alderton Grand is one of those hotels that exists in a different category from normal hotels. Not just expensive, not just upscale. I'm talking about the kind of place where the lobby has an original painting on the wall that probably costs more than every car I will ever own in my lifetime combined. Where the front desk staff are trained to remember the names and preferences of returning guests. Where there is a concierge whose entire job is to make impossible things happen. Need a reservation at a restaurant that has a 6-month wait list. Done. Need a specific bottle of wine that is only produced at one vineyard in France and sold in quantities of maybe 40 cases a year. Someone will make a call. Need a tailor in the building at 11 at night because a button fell off your jacket before a morning event. A tailor will appear. I knew none of this when I applied. I had been working overnight security at a mid-range business hotel downtown, the kind of place that hosts regional sales conferences and the occasional wedding. My supervisor then mentioned that the Alderton was looking for overnight staff and that the pay was significantly better. He knew someone who had worked there. He said it was a different world. I thought he was exaggerating. He was not exaggerating. My first night on the job, the head of security, a man named Gerald who had been with the hotel for 11 years, walked me through the property for orientation. The Alderton had 14 floors, 232 rooms, 4 penthouse suites on the top floor, 3 restaurants, 2 bars, a spa, a fitness center, an underground parking garage, and a ballroom that could seat 600 people. For overnight security, it was me and one other guard named Marcus covering the whole building, with Gerald on call if anything serious happened. We had a rotation. Lobby, floors, garage, back corridors, repeat. The whole loop took about 40 minutes if you walked it at a normal pace. Gerald told me to never rush it. He said the slower you walk, the more you see. That piece of advice turned out to be the most important thing anyone ever told me about that job. My first few weeks were uneventful. The hotel was full most nights, mostly business travelers during the week and leisure guests on weekends. The overnight hours were quiet, guests were asleep. The staff that remained overnight were mostly the front desk team, a night kitchen crew that handled late room service orders, and us. I'd do my loops, check the stairwells, check the garage, stand in the lobby for a stretch, then do it all again. Marcus was a good partner. Quiet guy, mid-40s, former military. He didn't talk much during shifts, which I respected. We communicated in this efficient shorthand that developed naturally over the first month. A look, a nod, a brief radio check. It worked. It was around week 5 that I had my first real moment of understanding what Gerald meant about walking slowly. It was a Wednesday night, sometime around 3 in the morning. I was doing a floor check on the 8th floor, which was one of the quieter floors, mostly long-stay business guests who kept regular schedules. I came around the corner near the ice machine alcove and almost walked directly into a man sitting on the floor against the wall with his back against the wallpaper and his knees pulled up to his chest. He was in a full suit, tie still on, shoes still on, and he had his phone in his hand, but the screen was dark. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open. He was just sitting there on the floor of the hallway at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing. I stopped. He looked up at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry, I just needed a minute." I asked him if he was okay, not in the scripted customer service way. I actually asked him like a person asks another person. He looked at me for a second and then nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, I just got some news tonight, family stuff. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't my room." I understood that in a way I didn't expect to. Sometimes a room feels too small to hold something heavy. Sometimes you need a hallway. I didn't push him. I told him to take his time, that I'd be back through in about 40 minutes, and if he needed anything at all to just flag me down. He nodded. When I came back through on my next loop, he was gone. His room door was closed. I never saw him again after that. But that moment lodged itself somewhere in my brain, because it was the first time I understood something about this job that nobody had told me directly. These weren't just rooms full of sleeping guests. These were people who had temporarily relocated themselves from their real lives into this suspended space, and sometimes the weight of those real lives followed them through the check-in process, regardless of how nice the room was. The Alderton could give them 1,000 thread count sheets and a pillow menu and a turned-on service with chocolates on the bed. It couldn't give them relief from whatever was actually going on. That was my first real lesson. Over the following months, I started paying attention differently, not in an invasive way. I wasn't eavesdropping on conversations or watching people through their doors. I started noticing the texture of the nights, the patterns, the things that were always there but that you'd miss if you were just going through the motions of a shift. The Alderton had a particular rhythm between 2 and 5 in the morning. Between midnight and 2, there was still some residual activity. The bars closed at 1:30, and there'd be guests making their way back upstairs, occasionally louder than they should have been, occasionally needing a gentle nudge toward their rooms rather than the lobby. That first hour and a half was still connected to the evening. It still had the social energy of whatever had come before it. But at 2 o'clock something shifted. The hotel went quiet in a specific way, not empty quiet, inhabited quiet. The building was full of people, but they had all retreated inward into sleep or into whatever private version of wakefulness they were managing, and in that quiet, the corridors revealed things. There was a woman on the 11th floor who I noticed around my 3rd month. She was a long-stay guest, which meant she had been there at least 2 weeks by the time I started registering her presence. Long-stay guests became familiar to the overnight staff in a way that regular guests didn't, because you'd see them repeatedly across multiple nights rather than just as a face passing through a lobby. Her name, according to the front desk staff, was Mrs. Calloway. She was in her early 60s, always impeccably dressed even at strange hours, and she had a habit of sitting in the small seating area near the elevator bank on the 11th floor between 3 and 4 in the morning. She was always reading, not on a phone or a tablet, an actual book, paperback, with a bookmark in it that she never seemed to advance very far on from night to night. She had a small bottle of sparkling water that she'd bring from her room, and she'd sit in that chair under the corridor light and read for an hour and then go back inside. The first time I saw her, I did a brief wellness check, just asking if she needed anything, explaining that I was on overnight security if she had any concerns. She smiled at me in this very composed, practiced way and said she was perfectly fine, thank you. She simply didn't sleep well and preferred not to disturb her husband by being restless in the room. I nodded and moved on, but I saw her again the next night, and the night after that, and every night for the next 3 weeks until she checked out. We never had a long conversation. She wasn't the type to invite one, and I wasn't the type to push for one, but there was an acknowledgement that built up between us. I'd come around the corner and she'd glance up from her book and give me a small nod, and I'd nod back and continue on my loop. That was it. Just 2 people acknowledging each other's presence in the quiet hours of the night. The night she left, she was in the lobby with her luggage at 5:30 in the morning. I was finishing my last loop of the shift. She saw me and said I wanted to say goodbye. I told her I hoped her stay had been comfortable. She looked at me for a moment and said it was exactly what I needed it to be. Then her car arrived and she left. I thought about her for days afterward. I still think about her sometimes, years later. I never knew what brought her there or what she was working through in those quiet hours with her unfinished book. But something about her presence, the discipline of it, the contained sadness of it, stayed with me in a way I couldn't shake. There was a particular weekend in my 4th month that I think about as the moment I truly understood the difference between what the Alderton appeared to be and what it actually was. The hotel was hosting a large private event that Saturday. I wasn't given many details beyond what I needed operationally, which was that floors 12 and 13 had been partially reserved for a group of guests connected to the event, that there would be elevated foot traffic until around midnight, and that we should expect a longer than usual wind-down period before things quieted. The event was some kind of industry gathering, finance or investment based on the guests. I didn't know specifics and didn't need to. What I noticed was this. Around 2:30 in the morning, when the night had settled and most of the event guests had retreated to their rooms, I was doing my loop on the 12th floor. Halfway down the corridor, I could hear 2 men talking, not fighting, not loud, just talking in that very particular way that people talk when they are exhausted and it's late and the social armor has come off. I wasn't trying to listen. The corridor acoustics carried their voices naturally as I walked. One of them was saying, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. And the other one said, nobody does. You just keep going because that's what you do. I passed the alcove where they were standing. 2 men in their 50s, jackets off, sleeves rolled up, both of them holding drinks that were mostly water by that point. They glanced at me and I gave them the standard nod and kept walking. But those 2 sentences sat with me for the rest of the shift, and honestly for a long time after. Because those 2 men, whoever they were, had spent that entire evening in a world of projecting success and confidence and authority. That's what events like that are. That's the entire architecture of it. Everyone is performing the version of themselves that belongs in that room. And then at 2:30 in the morning in an empty corridor, the performance came down for just a minute, and what was underneath was the same exhausted uncertainty that I'd heard in the voice of the man sitting on the 8th floor hallway floor in his suit. It didn't matter how much money was in that room. It didn't matter what the job title was or what the suite cost per night. At 2:30 in the morning, everyone was just a person trying to figure out how to keep going. I started carrying that observation with me on every shift after that. Marcus noticed that I had gotten more thoughtful about the job around that time. He asked me about it one night during a break, when we were both sitting in the small staff room off the lobby having coffee. He said, "You look like you're thinking about something every time I see you walking the floors." I told him what I'd been noticing, the patterns, the people, the things that showed up in the quiet hours. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he nodded and said, "Yeah." He said he'd been seeing it for 11 years, and it never really stopped being something. I asked him if it ever got to him. He thought about it for a second and then said, "It used to." He said in the first couple of years he'd go home and lie awake thinking about this person or that person and wondering what happened to them. He said eventually you find a way to hold it differently, not to care less, but to let it pass through you instead of accumulating. Otherwise it becomes a weight that you carry everywhere. I thought that was one of the most honest things anyone had ever said to me about any job. The thing about the overnight shift at a place like the Alderton is that you are functionally invisible. Not literally. Guests see you, they know you're there, but you exist in a different category from the people they actually interact with during the day. The front desk staff, the concierge, the restaurant servers, the bartenders, those are the faces of the hotel, the people guests form actual impressions of. Overnight security is infrastructure. You are the building keeping itself safe. And because of that, people move through the corridors with a different level of guardedness than they'd have if they were passing a smiling front desk agent. That invisibility was the job's most revealing quality. It was in my 6th month that I encountered what I can only describe as one of the stranger ongoing situations of my time at the Alderton. There was a man who checked in every other Thursday night and checked out every Saturday morning. Consistent as a calendar, the front desk staff knew him well enough to have his preferences on file. Corner room on the 9th floor, extra pillows, no turned-on service, sparkling water in the minibar stocked before arrival. He always checked in late, usually around 11 or 11:30, paid in cash, which was unusual but not unprecedented, and always used the same name on his reservation. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except for what I noticed on my floor checks. Every Friday night, without exception, sometime between 1 and 3 in the morning, I would walk the 9th floor and there would be a piece of paper slid under his door from the inside. Not from the outside, from inside the room, pushed out into the corridor, just a small folded piece of paper. The first time I saw it, I thought a guest had accidentally knocked something out under the door, which happens sometimes with receipts or notes. I picked it up to check if it needed to be returned, and I saw that it was blank on the outside, completely blank. I slid it back under the door because I didn't know what else to do with it. The second time I saw it, a month later, same room, same situation, I picked it up again. Still blank on the outside, I put it back. By the third time I'd stopped picking it up, I just noted it and moved on. I mentioned it to Marcus once. He already knew about it. He said it had been going on since before he started. He said Gerald knew about it too and had decided years ago that as long as nothing operational was happening and the guest wasn't a disturbance, what a paying guest did with a piece of paper in their own room was not the hotel's business. He said sometimes people have rituals that don't need to be explained. I've thought about that paper more times than I can count. I have no idea what it meant. I'm not sure I want to know. But the regularity of it, the precision of it, the fact that it happened every single time with no variation, told me that whatever it represented to him, it was important. Some private ceremony conducted in a hotel room every other Friday night, some act that required the paper to be on the other side of the door before morning. People are so much stranger and more layered than they present themselves to be. That's the thing I kept learning over and over in those corridors. In my 7th month, something happened that I think about more than almost anything else from those 4 years. It was a Saturday in February. The hotel was at near full capacity. There had been a winter storm warning all week, and a lot of guests who might have checked out Friday had extended their stays to avoid the roads. The building had this particular cozy heaviness that full hotels get in bad weather, where everyone is essentially hunkered down together in this temporary shared space. I was on a 4 o'clock loop, which is about as deep into the night as it gets, the stretch of time that feels furthest from both the previous evening and the coming morning. I came down the corridor on the 6th floor, and I heard something that stopped me completely. Someone was playing piano. Not a recording, live piano. Quiet, careful, like someone playing for themselves in the middle of the night. I stood in the corridor and listened for a moment, genuinely confused about where it was coming from, and then I remembered that room 614 had a baby grand piano in it. It was one of 2 rooms in the hotel that had in-room pianos. A feature marketed toward musician guests who wanted to be able to play in private. I had never actually heard one being played during an overnight shift before. The music was something classical that I didn't recognize. Not a full piece, more like fragments, phrases repeated and then varied and then returned to. Exploratory, like the person was working something out rather than performing it. I stood there for probably 3 minutes just listening in the empty corridor, which is not something I would normally do. But something about the sound in that specific context. 4 in the morning, winter storm outside, hotel full of sleeping strangers, one person at a piano working through something quietly in the dark, was so unexpectedly beautiful that I couldn't make myself move. I have never been a particularly emotional person. I want to be honest about that. I don't cry at movies. I don't get sentimental easily. But standing in that corridor at 4 in the morning listening to a stranger play piano in a hotel room during a snowstorm, I felt something open up in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. I think it was something close to grief, actually, not for anything specific, just a general recognition of something. That all of these people, all 200 and some guests in this building, were living through their one specific life, with all of its weight and complexity and music and sleeplessness and private rituals and corridor moments, and that they were each doing it essentially alone in the way that all of us are ultimately alone in our own experience, and that this hotel, this beautiful, expensive building, was just a temporary container for all of that. And I was the one walking the halls in the quiet watching it all, without being part of any of it. I think that's the moment the job became something different to me than just a job. I moved on eventually. I finished my loop. The piano was still going when I came back through the 6th floor 40 minutes later. By my next pass at 5:30 it had stopped. I never found out who was staying in 614 that night. I never tried to find out. But I hear that music sometimes, not literally, just in the way that certain things stay with you, as a kind of presence that reappears when the world gets quiet enough. By the time I reached my first full year at the Alderton, I had developed a relationship with the building itself that I can only describe as intimate. I knew which elevator doors took 3 seconds longer to close than the others. I knew which stretch of corridor on the 4th floor had a subtle slope in the flooring that you'd only notice if you walked it hundreds of times. I knew that the heating system in the East Wing made a particular low sound around 3:15 every morning that new staff always mistook for something concerning. I knew the exact quality of light in the lobby at 4:30 a.m., when the chandelier on its overnight dimmer setting cast everything in this amber half-light that made the whole space look like something preserved in amber. I knew this building the way you know a place you've spent thousands of quiet hours inside, not intellectually, physically. In your body. Marcus told me once that every building has a personality, and the overnight shift is the only time you get to meet it. I thought he was being poetic. By the end of my first year, I understood exactly what he meant. The Alderton's personality, if I had to describe it, was composed. That's the word I keep coming back to. Whatever happened inside it, whatever drama or grief or joy or strangeness passed through its corridors, the building absorbed it without changing its expression. The marble floors and the dark wood paneling and the carefully chosen art on the walls remained exactly as they were regardless of what was unfolding in the rooms behind the doors. There was something almost philosophical about that. The building didn't judge. It didn't remember in any way you could point to. It just held everything temporarily and then released it at checkout. I found that strangely comforting during the harder stretches of the job. And there were harder stretches, not dangerous ones mostly. The Alderton wasn't that kind of hotel. In 4 years I never once had to physically intervene in anything serious. There were drunk guests who needed redirecting, occasional noise complaints that required a knock on a door and a quiet word, one incident in the garage in my 2nd year that I'll get to. But the hard stretches I'm talking about were the emotionally heavy ones. The nights where what you witnessed in the corridors stayed with you in a way that sleep didn't fully clear. There was a period in my 14th month that I think of as the hardest week of the 4 years. It started on a Monday night when I encountered a young woman sitting on the floor outside room 723. She looked to be in her mid-20s. She was wearing a formal dress, the kind you'd wear to a nice dinner or an event, and she was sitting with her back against the door of her room with her shoes placed neatly beside her and her phone in her lap. She wasn't crying when I first saw her. She was just sitting very still with her eyes closed, breathing slowly and deliberately like someone who has been crying, and is in the process of pulling themselves back together. I did what I'd learned to do by that point, which was to slow down, not rush toward her, not project alarm onto the situation. I approached at a normal walking pace and said quietly that I was overnight security, just checking to make sure everything was all right. She opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "I'm fine." Then she said, "I'm really not fine, but I'm fine. I'll be fine." I crouched down to her level, which Gerald had taught me in the first weeks. He said that standing over someone who's on the floor is a power dynamic that doesn't help anyone. Get to their level. I asked her if she needed any assistance, if there was anything I could do. She shook her head slowly and then said, "Do you ever have a night where you realize that the story you've been telling yourself about your life is just completely wrong?" I didn't answer immediately because I wasn't sure she was asking me to answer. Sometimes people say things in the quiet hours that are really just thinking out loud, but she looked at me like she actually wanted to know, so I said yes. I said I thought most people had nights like that, and that the hotel hours in particular seemed to be when that kind of realization had a way of surfacing. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "That's actually kind of comforting." Then she picked up her shoes, stood up, said thank you for some reason, and went back into her room. I continued my loop, but I felt that questions settle into me and stay there. The story you've been telling yourself about your life. I'd been doing this job for over a year, and I still hadn't fully articulated to myself what I thought about it, what I was doing there, where it was leading. I was 26 years old, walking hotel corridors at 4 in the morning, watching other people's lives pass through a building like water through a pipe, and I hadn't asked myself in a while whether the story I was telling myself about my own life was accurate. That question, asked by a stranger in a formal dress sitting outside a hotel room at 2 in the morning, genuinely changed something in how I thought about my own situation. Not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden clarity or decision made that night, but something shifted in a direction that would eventually lead me to go back to school part-time at the end of my 3rd year. I've thought about that woman and whether she'd find it strange or meaningful to know that a question she asked mostly to herself in a hotel corridor ended up mattering to someone she'd never see again. 3 days after that, on a Thursday, I had what I can only describe as the most uncomfortable encounter of my entire time at the Alderton. I was doing a 2:30 loop on the 10th floor. The corridor was empty, as it almost always was at that hour, the kind of uniformly quiet stretch where the only sounds are the soft hum of the climate system and the occasional subtle creak of the building adjusting itself. I came around to the south end of the corridor and I found 2 people standing in the hallway, a man and a woman, both fully dressed, standing face to face about 2 feet apart, and they were completely silent. Not arguing silently, not in the middle of a tense conversation that they'd paused when they heard me coming. Just standing there in the corridor, facing each other, in this absolute stillness that felt like it had been going on for a long time before I arrived and would continue after I left. I slowed down. They both glanced at me briefly with the total lack of self-consciousness of people who have moved beyond caring about external perception, and then they looked back at each other. I walked past them at a measured pace, gave a quiet good evening, and kept moving. I don't know who they were, I don't know what was happening between them. It wasn't my place to know. But the image of those 2 people standing in the corridor at 2:30 in the morning, fully dressed, facing each other in complete silence, has never fully left me. It carried a weight that I could feel from 10 feet away. Whatever was happening between them was something too large for words or past the point of words. The silence wasn't empty, it was absolutely full. I've thought about what situation could produce that scene. A couple at the end of something, standing in a corridor because they couldn't be inside the room anymore. 2 people who'd just received news that changed everything. 2 people who'd said all there was to say and were standing in the aftermath. I've never settled on an explanation, and maybe that's the point. Some things in the overnight hours exist outside of narrative. They're just images. 2 people in a corridor, facing each other in the middle of the night. The garage incident I mentioned earlier happened in my 2nd year, around the 18th month mark. I want to be clear that nothing dangerous or criminal happened. I mention it because of what it represented to me about the particular ecology of a place like the Alderton. It was around 3 in the morning on a weeknight. I was doing a garage loop, which was the least eventful part of the rotation on most nights. The underground garage was well lit, orderly, full of expensive cars that sat perfectly still in their assigned spaces. It had a different quality than the rest of the hotel. No softness to it, just concrete and light and the smell of motor oil and a faint residual exhaust from the last arrivals hours earlier. I came around the 3rd row of vehicles and I found a teenage boy sitting on the hood of a car. Not just any car. A black Bentley Continental that I recognized as belonging to a guest on the 14th floor, one of the penthouse suites. The boy was maybe 16 or 17, wearing expensive casual clothes, headphones around his neck, eating a bag of chips like he was sitting on a park bench. He looked up at me with the particular brand of complete unbothered calm that belongs exclusively to people who have grown up with so much money that the concept of consequences has never quite taken root. I told him he needed to get off the vehicle. He looked at the car, then back at me, then said, "It's my dad's car." I told him that it didn't matter whose car it was. He wasn't permitted to be in the garage unaccompanied, and he needed to come with me back to the lobby. He looked at me for a moment the way that a certain type of wealthy teenager looks at security staff, which is a look that contains no hostility, but an absolute quiet certainty that the social order will ultimately resolve in their favor regardless of what they're told by someone who gets paid by the hour. Then he got off the hood, picked up his chips, and walked with me to the elevator without complaint. In the elevator, he asked me if the job was boring. I said it had its moments. He said he wished he had something to do at night because he couldn't sleep, and the hotel room felt like a cage. He said his family traveled like this constantly, and he'd been to 22 countries in the past 2 years, and he was 14. He said he'd give anything to just be in one place long enough to make a real friend. He said it matter-of-factly, not looking for sympathy, just stating it the way someone states a logistical fact. "I'm hungry, it's cold, I don't have any real friends." I walked him back to the 14th floor and he went back to his suite. I finished my shift, but I thought about that kid for a long time. The particular loneliness of a life that looks from the outside like everything anyone could want, from the inside lived on a Bentley hood in an empty parking garage at 3 in the morning, eating chips because there was nothing else to do. I think about him sometimes when people talk about what money can and can't solve. It was in my second year that I started to notice something I hadn't consciously registered before, which was the degree to which the Alderton functioned as a kind of neutral zone for people who needed to be temporarily outside the geography of their regular lives. What I mean by that is this: your regular life has location. It has your apartment or your house, your neighborhood, the grocery store you use, the faces you recognize, the routes you drive automatically. All of those things are continuous with your identity. You carry your life in those surroundings. When something happens, when your marriage starts falling apart, or your career hits a wall, or you lose someone, or you're making a decision that will change everything, you're making it inside all of those surroundings, which are constantly reminding you of who you are and what you have to lose. A hotel room removes all of that. You're in a space that belongs to no one and therefore temporarily belongs entirely to you, with none of the contextual weight of your actual life. The art on the walls means nothing to you. The furniture has no history with you. You can close the curtains and the city outside could be any city. In a strange way, that blank container gives people permission to feel things that the familiar textures of home won't let them access. I saw evidence of this constantly in my second and third years once I understood the pattern. People cried more freely in hotel rooms than they probably did at home, not because anything was sadder in hotels, but because the container gave them permission. I know this not from eavesdropping but from the particular quality of silence that follows crying, the muffled quality of a closed door with someone behind it letting something go. I learned to recognize it without intruding on it. It was part of the hotel's function, part of what people were sometimes paying for without knowing it. There was a man on the 5th floor during my second year, a long-stay guest, quiet, professional, polite to the staff, who I found sitting in the stairwell one night at around 2:45. Not a floor corridor this time. The actual stairwell, concrete stairs, fluorescent light, the kind of institutional space that exists in hard contrast to everything the Alderton presented itself as being. He was sitting on a step with his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face. I almost didn't go in because the stairwells had a different protocol. Guests weren't really supposed to be in them outside of emergencies, but something about the slump of his posture made me push open the door and check on him. He looked up when he heard me. His eyes were red. He was somewhere in his late 40s, solidly built, the kind of guy who had probably spent his whole life being the one everyone else leaned on. He said he was sorry, he just needed 5 minutes, he'd be out of the way. I told him he didn't need to apologize for anything. I asked if he needed water or anything from the hotel. He shook his head and then after a pause he said, "My father died this afternoon." I got the call at 4 p.m. I have a meeting tomorrow morning that I can't miss. I don't know what to do with that. I didn't say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate. Then I sat down on the step next to him, which was probably outside whatever the official protocol was for overnight security staff. I sat there for about 10 minutes. We didn't talk, I just sat there. Eventually he said thank you and stood up and went back to his room. I finished my shift. But that 10 minutes in the stairwell, with a stranger who had lost his father and had nowhere to put it, is something I carry with me in the specific way that certain moments insist on being remembered. Gerald asked me once, maybe 6 months before I eventually left the job, what I thought the work had done to me. He didn't phrase it negatively. He said done, not damaged. He said every overnight security person he'd ever trained came out of the years of those shifts with something they hadn't gone in with, some shift in how they understood people, and he was curious what mine was. I thought about it for a while, and then I said that I thought I'd become permanently less surprised by the complexity of people. That I'd gone in with some vague, unexamined assumption that people were mostly what they presented themselves as, and that what I'd learned was that what people presented was almost always a fraction of what was actually going on. And that the fraction they didn't present was not something to be suspicious of, but something to be kind about, because everyone was managing something that they weren't showing. Gerald nodded and said that was about right. He said the job had given him humility. He said before he started he'd been the kind of person who made quick assessments of people, looked at how they dressed or how they talked or how they carried themselves, and thought he had a read on them within the first 30 seconds. He said years of watching people in hotel corridors at 3 in the morning had made that kind of quick assessment feel not just inaccurate, but almost disrespectful. Everyone, he said, was a much longer story than they looked like from the outside. I wrote that down when I got home from that shift. It's still somewhere in a notebook I kept during those years. Everyone is a much longer story than they look like from the outside. I'd been working at the Alderton for 2.5 years, when the most sustained and genuinely moving sequence of nights I experienced there happened over the course of about 3 weeks. There was a couple who checked in on a Friday in October. They were in their late 70s, both of them, and they moved with that particular deliberate unhurriedness of people who have long since made peace with time. They checked into a standard suite on the 7th floor, which I noted because most guests in their demographic who came to the Alderton booked more elaborate accommodations. They were dressed simply nicely, but without the conspicuous quality that a lot of the Alderton's guests had. They looked like people who had been genuinely comfortable with each other for so long that performing anything for the outside world had become unnecessary. Over the first week, I started noticing them on my loops. They were consistently awake late, somewhere between 2 and 4, and consistently together. They'd be in the 7th floor seating area, or in the lobby, or in the corridor near the large window that looked out over the street below, always together, always talking quietly or sitting in comfortable silence. The man walked with a cane and moved slowly, and she always matched his pace without any apparent effort or adjustment. It was entirely natural, the physical synchronization of two people who had been moving through the world together for decades. I did my standard wellness check the first time I encountered them, and they were warm and polite and entirely composed. She told me they were celebrating their 54th wedding anniversary and had come back to the Alderton because they had stayed here on their honeymoon in 1971 and wanted to see it again. She said the building had changed quite a bit, but that some things were the same. She seemed genuinely pleased by which things were the same. Over the following 2 weeks, they became part of my nightly landscape. I looked for them on my loops the way you look for familiar landmarks. Some nights they'd be in the lobby with tea that the overnight staff had learned to have ready for them. Some nights they'd be in the corridor by the window watching the street below. They were never distressed. They were never anything but entirely at ease with each other and with their presence in that building at those hours. On one of the last nights of their stay, I was passing the window corridor on the 7th floor around 3:30 and they were there together. She was leaning slightly against his shoulder, and he had one arm around her and they were looking out at the street. The city at that hour was quiet but not empty. There were headlights moving far below, the distant suggestion of the world continuing in its ordinary way. I slowed down as I passed, and she turned slightly and smiled at me in that particular way she had, which was warm without being performance, genuine without being demonstrative. I nodded and kept going. I don't know what it looked like from their perspective, this long marriage observed in a hotel corridor by a security guard in the early hours of the morning. But from where I stood, in all 4 years of all the things I saw in those corridors, the image was the most complete. Two people, 54 years in, standing at a window in the middle of the night in a hotel they'd been to once before, just being exactly where they were. I think about what Gerald said about everyone being a longer story than they look like from the outside, and I think those two were a story that had found a good shape. Not a perfect one. Nobody has a perfect one, but a good one, a real one. They checked out on a Tuesday morning. She stopped at the security desk on the way out and left a handwritten note for me, which the morning staff passed on. It said, "Thank you for your kindness in the quiet hours. We appreciated not being invisible." I kept that note for a long time. In my 3rd year at the Alderton, something changed in me that I hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain at the time. The work had become second nature in the mechanical sense. I knew every inch of the building, every sound, every pattern. My body did the job automatically while my mind operated on a separate track, observing, processing, filing things away. But what changed in the 3rd year was that I started feeling the weight of the witnessing itself, not in a way that made me want to leave. Maury, in the way that a photographer who has taken thousands of pictures eventually starts to feel the accumulating significance of all those frozen moments. You become a kind of archive, and archives have weight. I started keeping a notebook around the 2-year and 8-month mark, not a journal exactly. Maury, a record of specific moments, images, fragments of conversation. Not names, not identifying details, just the texture of things. The man in the 8th floor corridor in his suit, Mrs. Calloway and her unfinished book, the piano in room 614, the couple at the 7th floor window, the boy on the Bentley. The 2 men in the corridor after the event, talking about how nobody knows how long they can keep going. Writing them down did something I hadn't expected, which was that it organized them. It turned them from accumulating pressure in my chest into something that had a form, that could be looked at and then set down. Marcus had talked about letting things pass through you rather than accumulate. The notebook became the mechanism for that. The things I wrote down stopped insisting on being remembered every quiet moment because they were somewhere now. They had a container. Gerald asked me once if I was writing a book. I told him it wasn't organized enough to be a book. He said the best things never start out organized enough. I told him I wasn't sure what I was doing with it. He said that was probably the right relationship to have with something you hadn't finished yet. I want to talk about the 4 a.m. hour specifically, because I think it was the hour that defined those years more than any other. There is a quality to 4 in the morning that is genuinely unlike any other time. I've tried to explain it to people who haven't experienced it regularly, and it's hard to convey without them dismissing it as just being tired. But it's not about tiredness. By 4 a.m. on a shift I'd been awake through, I was in a particular state of alertness that was different from the alertness of earlier hours, less defended somehow, more permeable. Like the mental filters that normally process experience had gotten thin from use, and things landed more directly. The hotel at 4 a.m. had a specific presence, full of sleeping people, full of the residue of their days, full of everything that had been felt and said and decided in the previous 24 hours. 232 rooms of contained human experience, and I was walking the corridors outside all of it, the only person in motion, the one who was awake while everyone else was under. There's a strange kind of privilege in that, and a strange kind of loneliness, both simultaneously every night. The loneliness wasn't sharp, I want to be clear about that. It wasn't the loneliness of isolation or rejection. It was the loneliness of being a particular kind of witness, of being the person who sees without participating. The overnight security guard at a luxury hotel exists in a specific social position that has no real equivalent elsewhere. You are present in the most intimate hours of other people's temporary lives, and you are entirely separate from them. You are the building's consciousness, not its inhabitant. I came to think of that position as a genuine vocation, rather than just a job somewhere around the middle of my 3rd year. Not in any grand way. I didn't feel called in some spiritual sense, but I recognized that what I was doing required something that not everyone could bring to it. And that the quality of attention I'd developed over those years was real and earned, and not nothing. There was a night in my 3rd year, late autumn, where the hotel was hosting a large wedding. Not in the ballroom, which would have been the obvious venue, but split across the ballroom and several of the private event spaces on the 2nd floor. It was a large wedding, 300 guests, and the celebration had gone until nearly midnight, which meant the hotel was louder and more alive than usual well into the overnight hours. By 2 a.m. the wedding guests had mostly dispersed to their rooms, but the residue of the event was all over the building. Decorations being cleared by the event staff in the ballroom, the particular smell of a large celebration, food and flowers and candles, and the faint sweetness of spilled champagne, drifting through the lobby. Noise from a handful of rooms on the 6th floor where a group of younger guests had clearly not finished celebrating. I did a loop through the lobby around 2:15 and found the bride sitting alone in the armchair near the east fireplace, still in her dress, still with her hair up. She had her shoes off and she was sitting sideways in the chair with her legs draped over the armrest, and she was eating a room service order of French fries from a paper bag. She looked, more than anything else, peaceful. I did my standard check, asking if she needed anything, if everything was all right. She looked up and smiled at me with the expression of someone who had just come through something enormous and had landed safely on the other side of it. She said everything was absolutely perfect, and that she was just having a moment of quiet before going upstairs. She said the day had been so full of people and noise and love and emotion that she needed 10 minutes to just sit by herself and eat French fries. I told her that was a completely reasonable thing to need. She laughed and said her husband was upstairs asleep because he'd had 3 glasses of champagne, and she'd had one because she'd been too nervous to drink. She said she'd been planning this day for 14 months, and now it was over, and she wasn't sad exactly, but she felt the particular specific weight of a thing you've been anticipating for so long finally being in the past tense. I understood that feeling in the way that you understand things that haven't happened to you yet, but that you recognize from something deeper than experience. She ate her French fries. I continued my loop. When I came back through the lobby 20 minutes later, she was gone, the paper bag folded neatly on the side table next to the chair, her evening officially over. I think about her sometimes and hope she got what she was hoping for, not just in the wedding, but in everything that came after it, the long unplanned stretch of ordinary days that follows a day that has been planned down to the last detail. That's the part nobody prepares for and everybody has to figure out. It was in the final stretch of my third year that I started going back to school part-time. I'd been thinking about it since that night the young woman asked about the story you tell yourself about your life. I enrolled in evening classes twice a week in social work, which felt like the honest direction, given what the years in those corridors had clarified for me about what I actually cared about. I didn't tell many people at the hotel. Gerald knew and Marcus knew, and they were both quietly supportive in that particular way of people who don't make a big deal of things they think deserve a big deal. The combination of overnight shifts and evening classes reshaped my relationship with time in ways that were genuinely strange. My schedule was inverted from the rest of the world in a way that made normal social interaction logistically complicated. I'd be getting home as the city was waking up. I'd sleep through the morning into the early afternoon. I'd go to class in the evening and then go to work at midnight and do it all again. The weeks had a specific texture that I've never experienced before or since. There was something almost meditative about it, the way the schedule cut me loose from the ordinary rhythms of the world and put me in something that was entirely my own. During that period, the overnight shifts took on an additional quality, which was that I was now also processing everything I was learning in my classes through the lens of what I saw every night. The coursework in social work was full of frameworks for understanding human behavior, for thinking about need and stress and resilience, and the way people manage the gap between who they are and what they have to perform for the world. And I was living inside a laboratory of exactly that, every single night, walking corridors through which passed every possible variation of the human situation. It made me a better student. It also made me understand things about the job retroactively, gave language to things I'd observed for years without the vocabulary to fully articulate. The man in the stairwell who'd lost his father and had a meeting the next morning was not just a man in a stairwell. He was someone navigating an impossible collision between grief and obligation, between the full stop that loss creates and the world's requirement to keep moving. The two men in the corridor after the finance event, talking about not knowing how long they could keep going, were not just tired businessmen. They were people at an exposure point, a moment where the gap between what they performed and what they actually felt had temporarily closed because the hour was too late and the armor too heavy to keep in place. I don't mean to academicize what were essentially human moments. The frameworks were useful scaffolding, but they weren't the point. The point was always the people. The frameworks just helped me hold what I was seeing in a way that didn't crush me. My last year at the Alderton was different from the first three in a quality I find difficult to articulate precisely. The job itself was the same. The building was the same. Marcus was still there, still quiet, still making the best coffee in the staff room at 3 in the morning. Gerald was still there, 11 years becoming 12 and then 13, but I was different. I knew I was leaving. Not immediately, not with a specific date set, but I could feel the shape of the thing changing. I was going to finish school. I was going to work with people more directly than a security rounds rotation allowed for. The Alderton had given me something that I needed, and that I was nearly finished needing in the way I'd needed it. Not that it had exhausted its lessons. I'm not sure those nights will ever exhaust their lessons for me. But I had received what I was there to receive, and the time had a natural conclusion approaching. In my final 6 months, I found myself doing the loops differently. Not less carefully, never that, but with a more conscious awareness that each loop was one of a finite number remaining. I was memorizing the building rather than just walking it, noting the specific amber quality of the lobby light, the exact sound of the elevator on the east bank, the view from the window on the 7th floor corridor, where the old couple had stood looking at the city below. I want to tell you about the last significant night I had at the Alderton, which happened about 3 weeks before I put in my notice. It was a February night, one of the coldest of that winter, and the hotel was about half occupied. That particular combination, midweek in deep winter with low occupancy, produced a specific stillness in the building that was unlike the stillness of a busy hotel quiet at 4 a.m. When the hotel was full, the silence had density to it, the compressed presence of hundreds of sleeping people. When occupancy was low, the silence was more open, more literal, more like actual quiet rather than suppressed activity. I was on a 240 loop on the 9th floor. The corridor was empty in both directions as far as I could see. I was somewhere near the middle of the long hallway when I stopped walking for no particular reason. Nothing had caught my attention. No sound, no movement, I just stopped. And I stood there in the corridor for what was probably 45 seconds, but felt much longer, looking down the length of the hallway, the identical doors repeating in both directions, the soft corridor lighting, the patterned carpet, the complete absolute quiet of a luxury hotel at 2:40 in the morning in deep February. I don't know what I was doing exactly. Saying goodbye to something maybe, before I had consciously decided to say goodbye, acknowledging the years in some private way that didn't require witnesses, just standing in the corridor and letting the full weight of what I'd spent 4 years observing pass through me for a moment. What passed through was a lot, every face, every fragment, the woman in the formal dress on the floor outside room 723, Mrs. Calloway and her book, the piano in 614, the bride and her French fries, the boy on the Bentley, the man in the stairwell with his hands over his face, the two people standing in silence on the 10th floor facing each other in the dark. The old couple at the 7th floor window, 54 years in, leaning against each other and watching the city move below them in the middle of the night. All of it was there in the corridor for that 45 seconds, not as memory exactly, as presence, the building holding everything it had witnessed, offering it back one more time. Then I started walking again, because that's what the job required. You keep moving, you complete the loop. The shift doesn't pause for your interior life regardless of what's happening in it. I put in my notice 3 weeks later. Gerald shook my hand and said the building would miss me, which I took as his way of saying he would. Marcus nodded and said good and then went back to his coffee, which was exactly the right response. I worked my final 2 weeks with the same care I'd tried to bring to every shift, and on my last night I did a final loop of the whole building, all 14 floors, the garage, the stairwells, the lobby, the corridors, every stretch of carpet that I had walked hundreds and hundreds of times in the quiet hours, while the city slept outside and the guests slept behind their doors, and the building held everything it was temporarily given to hold. It was 4:20 in the morning when I finished that last loop and came back to the lobby. The chandelier was on its overnight dimmer. The marble floors caught the amber light the way they always had. Outside the tall front windows, the street was still and empty in the particular way of very early February mornings, just before the first edges of the world begin to stir back to life. I stood in the lobby for a minute, in that light, in that quiet, not thinking about anything specific, just being in the building one last time in the hour that had always been its most honest hour. Then I clocked out. I walked through the service entrance and out into the cold, and the city was starting its first grey light somewhere on the horizon, and I had 4 years of nights in my chest, and I walked home through streets that were just beginning to remember themselves, thinking about all the people who were still asleep in rooms behind closed doors, and everything they were carrying that no one else would ever know about. And how the world is so much fuller and stranger and sadder and more beautiful than it looks from the outside. That's the thing the corridors taught me, finally, after 4 years and thousands of loops, and all those quiet witnesses. Everyone is always in the middle of something. Everyone is managing more than they show. And in the deep quiet hours, when the armor comes off and the city sleeps and the only person moving is the one walking the halls, the whole enormous complicated truth of that becomes impossible to look away from. I've been in social work for 3 years now. I work with people directly, in rooms with good light during ordinary hours, and I carry the corridors with me into every conversation. The unhurried attention, the understanding that what's presented is always a fraction of what's real, the willingness to sit on a cold stairwell step next to someone who has nowhere to put their grief. Gerald was right, the building did something to me, something permanent and good and necessary. I'm grateful for every quiet loop of it. There are moments that don't belong to any single shift, but that accumulate across the years into something that functions like a worldview. I've been trying to describe that worldview throughout this account, but I want to spend this final stretch of it being more direct about what I actually came away with. Not the individual stories as much as those matter, but the underlying thing, the thing all the stories were pointing toward. I want to start with something that happened in my 4th year that I haven't mentioned yet because I've been saving it, not consciously, but when I think back over the Alderton years and try to identify the moment that crystallized everything most completely, this is the one I arrive at every time. It was a Thursday night in early spring of my last year. The hotel was moderately occupied. Nothing unusual about the evening, no events, no large groups, no particular reason for anything out of the ordinary to happen. I was doing a 3:30 loop on the 11th floor when I heard what I can only describe as laughter that had gone wrong. It wasn't crying exactly, and it wasn't conventional laughter. It was somewhere in between, the kind of sound that happens when something is so absurd or so overwhelming that the normal categories of emotional response don't apply, and the body just produces whatever it can. The sound was coming from behind a door near the end of the corridor. I stopped outside it and listened for a moment. It continued, irregular, slightly breathless, genuinely unclassifiable. I knocked quietly and identified myself as overnight security. The laughter, or whatever it was, stopped. There was a pause, and then the door opened. The woman standing in the doorway was somewhere in her early 40s, hair pulled back loosely, wearing pajamas and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as caught, like someone found doing something they weren't sure was allowed. Then she said, "I'm sorry, I know that must have sounded alarming. I just finished reading my late mother's diary, and there's a section in it that's genuinely the funniest thing I've ever read, and I don't know what to do with that." I asked if she was all right. She thought about it honestly for a moment and said, "I think I actually am. I think that's the strange part." She had been staying at the Alderton for 3 days while handling her mother's estate. Her mother had lived in the city and the family home had already been sold, so there was nowhere local to stay. She had found the diary while sorting through the last of her mother's belongings that afternoon and had brought it back to the hotel and been reading it for hours. She said her mother had been a reserved woman in life, formal in a way that had sometimes made closeness difficult. The diary was completely different. Warm and funny, and occasionally irreverent and full of private opinions, her mother had apparently kept entirely to herself for decades. She said she felt like she was meeting her mother for the first time and losing her all over again simultaneously. She held up the diary, this worn brown notebook, and said she was so funny. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. I stood in the doorway of that room at 3:30 in the morning and looked at this woman holding her dead mother's diary in a hotel room that had no connection to either of them, and I thought about how this was what the Alderton was in the end, a space where the things that couldn't be felt at home finally had room to surface. She wasn't crying at the diary in her mother's house, surrounded by the weight of that specific grief. She was here in this neutral container, and so the grief had come out as laughter, which was maybe the truest form of it. I asked her if she needed anything. She said she needed nothing. She said she was going to keep reading. She thanked me and gently closed the door. I stood in the corridor for a moment and then continued my loop. But I carried that image with me out of the hotel when I eventually left, and I carry it still. A woman alone in a hotel room at 3:30 in the morning, laughing and grieving over a diary, discovering her mother after her mother was gone. I don't think there is a more human image than that. I genuinely don't. Something I've been circling around throughout this account and want to address directly is the question of what I think the overnight hours actually are. Not just in hotels. In general, what is it about the deep night that makes people more themselves, or more honest, or more willing to let what is actually happening inside them come to the surface? I have a theory, developed slowly over 4 years of empirical observation. I think the self that most people present during ordinary daytime hours is genuinely effortful, not false exactly, more like edited. We make hundreds of small adjustments constantly, calibrating how we present ourselves based on who is watching, what is expected, what the situation calls for. This is not dishonesty. It is social functioning. It is how people move through the world without constant friction. The editing is mostly unconscious and mostly serves everyone involved. But editing is work, and by 2, 3, 4 in the morning, that work has simply run out of fuel. The mechanisms that maintain the edited self require the same energy that everything else requires, and deep in the night that energy is gone. What remains is less constructed, more fundamental. The man in the suit on the floor of the corridor wasn't performing grief. He wasn't managing how his grief appeared to others. He was just in it in the corridor because the night had used up everything else, and that was what was left. I think that's what I was witnessing across 4 years. Not people at their worst or their most vulnerable in a concerning way. People at their most actual. The word I keep coming back to is unedited. The night strips the editing out, and what's left is something closer to the truth of a person than what they walk around showing during the day. That is not a comfortable thing to be the witness of night after night, but it is an extraordinary privilege, and I want to name it as that clearly. Whatever the job cost me in sleep schedule and social normalcy, and the particular loneliness of being the one who watches while everyone else rests, the privilege of that witnessing was worth every part of the cost. I want to talk about Marcus for a moment, because I've mentioned him throughout this account in a supporting role, and he deserves more than that. Marcus was the most quietly perceptive person I've ever worked alongside. He processed everything but revealed almost nothing in real time. He had a quality of attentiveness that I aspired to and never fully reached, a kind of absolute stillness in his presence that meant people, even strangers passing in a lobby, seemed to relax slightly when they walked past him. I noticed this early, but it took me a long time to understand what was producing it. Eventually, I figured out that Marcus never projected anything onto any situation. He arrived at every moment completely without expectation, took it exactly as it was, and responded to what was actually there rather than to his anticipation of what might be there. In 11 years of overnight shifts, he had probably witnessed more of the Alderton's interior life than anyone alive. I asked him once what he thought about all of it, the accumulation of it, the years and years of watching people in the quiet hours. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I think people are doing the best they can with what they have." He paused and then added, "And I think what they have is usually less than you'd assume from the outside." That's Marcus's entire philosophy in 2 sentences. It took him 11 years to arrive at it, and he delivered it over bad coffee in a hotel staff room at 3 in the morning, and it is one of the most useful things I have ever been told. People are doing the best they can with what they have, and what they have is usually less than it looks like from the outside. I've applied that framework to virtually every difficult human interaction I've had in my social work career since leaving the Alderton. It doesn't solve everything. There are situations where more is required than charitable interpretation. But as a starting position, as the baseline orientation with which you enter a room and look at the person across from you, it is extraordinarily functional. It produces patience. It produces curiosity rather than judgment. It produces the willingness to sit with someone in their difficulty rather than trying to resolve it quickly so you can move on. Marcus taught me that without intending to, just by demonstrating it every night for 2.5 years. In my final months at the Alderton, I found myself doing something on my loops that I had never done in the earlier years, which was occasionally stopping in a corridor and simply standing still for a moment, not in response to anything, just as an act of presence. A deliberate acknowledgement of being there, in that specific corridor, in that specific hour, in that specific building full of specific people, all of it unrepeatable, all of it passing, all of it mattering in ways that would never be fully known. Gerald saw me doing it once, during one of his occasional overnight check-ins. He came around the corner on the 9th floor and found me standing still in the middle of the corridor looking at nothing in particular. He stopped and stood next to me and looked down the same corridor for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He said that like it was the completion of something, like it was the answer to a question he'd been waiting 4 years for me to figure out. I didn't ask him what he meant. I think I already knew. The building deserved to be stood still in occasionally. All the things it held deserved a witness who wasn't always in motion. The loops were necessary, and the loops were right, and you walked them with care, but sometimes you stopped. Sometimes you just stood in the corridor at 3 in the morning and let the full weight of it be what it was. That's it, that's the whole lesson, finally, after 4 years and thousands of miles of carpet and hundreds of faces, and all those quiet hours. You walk the loops, you pay attention. You arrive at each moment without expectation and you take it as it is. You sit on the step next to someone who has nowhere to put their grief. You let the piano play in the dark room and you stand in the corridor and you listen. You carry the things you witness with care, enough care that they stay alive in you without crushing you. You let people be longer stories than they look like from the outside. You remember that everyone is managing something invisible. And sometimes in the middle of the loop, in the deepest part of the night, when the building is full and still, and the city is somewhere outside in its own quiet, you stop walking. And you stand there. And you let it all be exactly what it is. I left the Alderton on a February morning just as the first light was coming up grey and cold over the city. I handed in my badge at the security desk. I shook Gerald's hand. I nodded at Marcus. I walked through the service entrance and into the cold air, and I stood on the pavement for a moment looking up at the building from the outside. 14 floors of lit and dark windows, all those rooms, all those people, all those stories I would never know the endings of. Then I turned and walked home through streets that were just beginning to fill with the first movement of ordinary morning. Delivery trucks and early joggers and pigeons resettling on ledges, the whole city drawing its first waking breath, and I thought about every person still asleep in every window I passed, and all the things they were carrying that no one could see. And I walked with that weight in my chest that is not quite sadness, and not quite gratitude, but something that lives between those two things, and has no better name. I have been in social work for 3 years now. I sit across from people in rooms with good light, and I listen to them with everything I learned in the corridors, the unhurried attention, the willingness to receive what is actually being offered rather than what I expect, the understanding that what I am looking at is always the surface of something much deeper and longer and more complicated than what is visible. I am better at this work for every hour I spent in those hotels. I am certain of that. The Alderton is still there. I've walked past it a few times in the years since, and I always stop for a moment on the pavement outside and look up at the building, and think about Gerald and Marcus and Mrs. Calloway, and the piano player and the bride with her French fries and the couple at the window and the woman with her mother's diary. And I think about all the people in there right now, tonight, at whatever hour it is, lying awake in their room or sitting in a corridor or standing at a window looking out at the city below. thinking about things they don't know how to say, carrying things they can't put down, being more themselves than they are allowed to be anywhere else. And somewhere in that building, in the quiet, in the amber half-light, someone is walking the loops, paying attention to things that most people would walk right past, being the witness that every building full of sleeping humans quietly requires. I hope they're walking slowly. That's the whole thing, that's all of it. Walk slowly, you'll see more.